E ngā iwi, o ngā hau e whānau mai haere mai ki tēnei papahotanga marunga i purangi e whakapāo atu ki Aotearoa nei, puta noa ki ngā motu o te ao whānui. Of course, Cafe Kōrero, brought to you by te Ara Taiohi. And tuatahi nei rā te mihi ki ngā marae aitua, ngā mate o te motu, haere atu rā. Nau mai te ao ki a tātou te hunga ora, e tū te Māori ki urunga. Māori ora ki a tātou katoa. Hoi noa nei rā tō tātou karakia, tō tātou ruruku, hei whakatūwhera, ko hauora. Moi ara rā te whiwhi a iuta, moi ara rā te rawe a iuta, moi ara rā te iho me te hari ki tai. Ko hau tupua, ko hauora. Ora ki te whakatupua, ora ki te whakatawhito, kai te tuhi, kai te rarama, hura mai te rā, ti hei Māori ora. Tēnei rā te whakaputa nā te pū, nā te weo, nā te aka, nā te tāmore, nāku nā tēnei tamaiti, nāku nā tēnei tauira. Tū te ihi, tū te koko, tū te mana, tū te tapu, he tapu nā rongo mātāne, nā rongo tau matuarua, tāwhia ki te rangi, ki a rehua, ki a tama i te ao mārama. Kā tū te paki o ruhi, kā tū te paki o hewa, kā tū te paki o rongo, kōrongo, kōrongo, kōrongo ki te whakatupua, kōrongo ki te whakatawhito, ki te maimai aroha, e aroha. E rongo e whakairihia ake kirunga hei. Turuturu o whiti ka whakamaua ki a tīna, tīna te more i Hawaii, te tāmore nui mo te oranga o ngā tamariki, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Tika te kōrero, nau mai, hara mai, and welcome to this live broadcast. And of course, for those watching it later on replay, tēnā rā koutou katoa, welcome. My name is Noel Woods from the Office of the Children's Commissioner, and just want to acknowledge all of our staff here. And just a reminder, of course, Andrew Beecroft, he's going to be departing as Children's Commissioner at the end of this year. So, big changes ahead. Here at the office. So hoi anō e te iwi, just want to share the vision of te Ara Taiohi is te puawaitanga Taiohi o Aotearoa, the young people to thrive here in Aotearoa. And of course their mission, a beautiful one, mo te oranga o ngā Taiohi, me ngā kaitiaki e mahi ana mō rātou. Of course their mission is for the well-being of Taiohi and the people who support them. Now our pai kōrero today are rangatira who bring many years of experience into the space, and introducing Rod Baxter, of course, experience in youth work and leadership to his role as Chief Executive Officer of Prince's Trust New Zealand. Rod has a background in youth work, education, supervision and theatre, an accomplished facilitator and partnership builder at local, national and global levels. And of course, Jane Zintl, the Chief Executive Officer at Ara Taiohi, a former youth worker, a lawyer, strengths coach, ethics champion and guru, relational bookworm. She's faith-based and passionate about youth development. Now, the kaupapa that drives her mahi with young people is a belief that when we are confident in our own identity, we are able to truly celebrate the success of others. No doubt the voice of our mokopuna brings integrity, passion and justice to our nation. So I'd like to welcome in Rod Baxter and Jane Zintl. Tēnā kōrua. Jane, I'll kick off with you. Ko wai no here, tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you so much for that beautiful karakia to start this time. Ko waio, ko Rosevere te motu, ko Atlantic te moana, ko Rosevere rawa ko Roth o kutupuna, no te upuku o te ika hau, ko Jane te koingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. So cool to be here. Oh my gosh, I just want to say first of all that I've been watching the other Kōrero Café and the standard is high. And so it's mildly intimidating, but I'm pleased to be here with friends, not only in the presentation space, but also friends in the chat and participating in this what is it, a webinar? I don't know. Participating in this time with us. My name's Jane, obviously. Thank you for the introduction, Noel. A little bit about me. I am married. I have 3 kids. My eldest has left home and gone back to Ototahi, where we spent a lot of our life. He moved out last Monday, and I literally felt like part of my heart was being ripped out and moved back down to Ototahi. And I have 2 teenagers who are still at home, grappling with the realities of NCEA and schooling during, the season that we're all having to navigate together. And we also have a cat who is very spoiled and has never peed in a box. And shall I just pass over to Rod to share a little bit about who he is?
Yeah, Rod.
never peed in a box that you're aware of, Jane. Ko Kaukau te maunga te runei taku ngākau. Kaukau is the mountain that speaks to my heart, and it's where I proposed to my now husband, Dylan. Ko Korimako te awa e mahia nei aku ma harahara. Korimako is the stream that trickles at the bottom of the place we live, and we go there sometimes to reflect on the day. Nor te whanganui Atara ahau. I live here in Pornicky in Wellington. I live in a place that was blessed by Matua James, te wharemanaki o Korimako, e mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nihi o te whanganui Atara I noho nei au. I really like being Pākehā, and as part of that commitment, I recognise the ancestral and spiritual landmarks of this place that I feel blessed to live. That's probably enough about me.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. And as mentioned, my name is Noel Rawiri Woods, he uri no Atiawa ngā rua hinerangi me Ngāti Pro. Grew up here in Te Whangarui Atara, out of Waifetu Marae, so te ahi kā o tēnei arohe, mihi ana kia koutou. So yeah, I'm currently at the Office of the Children's Commissioner as a kairaranga. I work in the communications team as well as the My World team, which is our Youth Voices team with my colleagues Peter Foese, Laura Ginjal and Ruby Sands, who have just joined us as well. So, but also I'm a creative native. I work on the radio at Atiawa FM. I'm a musician. I make Māori music, so just trying to normalise our reo through waiata. So I was lucky enough to grow up with those foundational skills around te reo me ona tikanga through the Koanga Reo movement in 1982. And I wish all our mokopuna taiohi had that same experience. So no doubt plenty of work to do to get to that moi moia. We're not. That's enough about me. Let's move on to you first of all, Rod, and tell us how you got started in youth work.
Thanks, Noel. Well, when I got started in youth work because I've been reading comic books for a very long time, since I could read, and the old manager of the Cuba Street comic shop volunteered at Youthline. And when I was 14, he told me this, and I told him that I wanted to volunteer at Youthline because at 14 I had a lot of life experience. And he told me to go get some more life experience, but I could volunteer on their street appeal collection day. And I remember meeting these other Youthline volunteers and just thinking that they were the coolest people. I went to a Catholic school, and one of them used the word ungodly to describe the hour that he woke up that morning. And I remember feeling like ungodly was the coolest word ever. So yeah, that's probably what kind of piqued my interest. And then after I left school, volunteered at Youthline and worked in a community centre context.
Kia ora, over to you, Jane. How did you get started working with our mokopuna or Aotearoa?
Yeah, my journey with youth work started in a faith-based context. A lot of youth workers have had an experience in their own youth years that draws them into kind of youth work as a profession, because it's a heart profession. It's not a particularly well-paid profession, although that's something we continue to advocate to see change in. And so my teenage years were tough, for my mental health particularly, and having gone through that and having good support through that, but no youth work support through that, I landed in a youth group, a youth community in a church, and just found so much acceptance, so much that sense of belonging. Yeah, found a sense of belonging. And for those that have experience in faith communities, often when you're a young adult, I was at university at the time, and you kind of come in and you got lots of energy, they very quickly make you a youth leader. So within 3 months of joining, I was put into some form of youth leadership, and lacked some of the resources that I'm now aware of that could have probably made that a little smoother. But actually the heart was always there, and I still have relationship with most of the rangatahi that we journeyed with through that time, through the highs and the lows that came from there. Just to weave myself through to where I am today, I was actually studying law at university at the time and ended up being very involved in youth law. and advice, advocacy, etc. for rangatahi. And that was the start of my journey with the wider youth development sector, particularly led with some of my heroes. So John Harrington down in Christchurch, who was very, very active at the time. And he just dragged me into everything, really. So, so those strands led me to the role that I'm in today.
Kia ora. And just while I got you, Jane, briefly explain to our viewers the role of Ara Taiohi.
Awesome. Ara Taiohi is the peak body for youth development in Aotearoa, which we still don't like as a phrase, but is very descriptive of what we are. So we hold the space nationally or centrally for youth work, for young people, and for youth development. And so we're a membership organisation, and all our members work with young people. Many of them are youth workers. Many of them don't identify as youth workers, but are still working with rangatahi. And our job is to advocate for all of that mahi, which is so important. It's always important, and it's particularly important in this COVID, hopefully one day post-COVID reality, when we look at the impacts on our rangatahi in areas of mental health, etc. So our role is advocacy as well as capacity and capability building. Our heart is to make sure that the really great mahi that is happening on the ground, that the people who are doing that are connected and supported and upskilled and learning and not isolated and vulnerable. So that's part of our role as Ara Taiohi. And we partner with a lot of other groups, including your one, Noel, but also our regional networks are really important for when those things are working together. We see the best support for youth workers, which helps us to see our vision achieved of seeing young people thrive.
Yeah, Tahua, and just want to thank the team for a well-organised, involved conference here in Wellington. Just got through before the lockdown. And just checking out your background, Rod, a korowai tupu hea hanga kōrero, tell us all about it.
Cool. Well, so Korowai Tupu is the professional association for youth work in Aotearoa, and it sits within Ara Taiohi. So it's also membership-based, and essentially there's a set of core competencies that youth workers reflect on as part of their membership application and then join the community. So it kind of adds to the legitimacy and the professional status that we all share in youth work and kind of reinforces our identity. It was just launched a couple of years ago. In fact, Andrew Beecroft was there at the launch and spoke, which was amazing. And yeah, recently I've been the chairperson of the Rōpū.
Yeah, Tahua, and just a shout out to all our viewers that have joined us today. Bueno, let's get into the kaupapa. Kaiparahuarahi, defining youth work. As Peter Foese mentioned, 21 pieces of mātauranga that no doubt will assist youth practitioners on their journey. So maybe let's kick off with you, Jane. Share with us the piece of mahi you did in Kaiparahuarahi around defining youth work.
Awesome. So for those that haven't seen it, I've just realized with the background it's quite tricky, but this is the beautiful taonga that we're talking about. So it's the 4th edition of Kaiparahuarahi, which is the journal for youth work we have. And every edition usually comes out once a year. Every edition has had a particular focus that's been super important for how youth work itself is growing and developing. And we always have a variety of people contribute to it. But this particular edition has an article that was co-authored by Rod and myself, which collates a whole lot of definitions. And I do need to acknowledge that we have co-authorship, but if we were apportioning percentages to it, it would by far be majoritarily contributed to by Rod. He had 3 full 12-hour days. Is that right? Did I say it right? Writing this massive chunks of this article. So I just mihi to my friend and want to acknowledge that. The heart for this one comes from, so those of us who have been around in youth work a while, every so often the definition of youth work comes up as a challenge that we have in front of us, and we all tend to do the same thing, which is roll our eyes, and we've talked about it forever, and it feels like a really difficult thing to do. Partly because, as we discuss in the article, it's such a heart mahi, you know, we know what we do makes a difference, we know it works, but articulating the stuff that's behind that is sometimes really, really difficult. The reason we felt like we really needed to push this conversation on one of the parent organisations of Ara Taiohi was the National Youth Workers Network of Aotearoa, and they had started some intentional discussion around defining youth work, and we had a good start on that, and then it had kind of died down somewhat as we transitioned across organisations. The last year or two in youth work have highlighted how important this conversation is, because it's not just about having a definition, you know, like that you can say that's short and snappy. It's actually about identity. And when we start to talk about the identity of youth work, we have to acknowledge that the identity of anybody or anything intersects with the identity of other spaces. And so for us in the last year or so, some of the advancements there have been for the identity of social work is something that impacts on us as youth workers. So social work compulsory registration has come in. There has been a scope of practice that came in associated with that. And youth work was specifically mentioned in that as part of as the title of youth work, as part of the scope of practice. And that's really concerning because we appreciate and value our social work colleagues, but it's not youth work, yeah? And so that was part of it. We also had the Social Work Registration Board took a case against a youth worker who had qualified as a social worker and had been registered as a social worker. And the purpose of today is not to go into all the details of that, but that youth worker was fined a lot of money, despite the fact he no longer identified as a social worker at all, and was employed as a youth worker and practicing as a youth worker. And so those types of things, and I could add to the list, but those types of things have highlighted that we need to be able to answer the question, what is youth work? We're asked it by a lot of people. When we're advocating for youth work, we need to be able to answer that question. We need to answer it well, articulately, and we need to make sure that those answers are about our identity and defining our identity as distinct from other professional identities that are all very, very valuable as well. So the idea of Kaiparahuarahi, and in particular this article, was let's start to gather the voices. Ara Taiohi, we don't see ourselves as able to decide what the definition is, but we do see ourselves as a membership organisation as creating space for all the different insights to come into it. Our hope is that Kaiparahuarahi and even these Kōrero Café are going to be catalysts for more and more conversation, kōrero, wānanga, let's make this live, and you're never going to get like 100% united consensus, but let's weave these things together so that we have something that as a nation we feel we can stand strong on. So that was the context, I think, for the article. I might throw it over to Rod to pick up on some of the approaches that we took in the article, particularly to the definitions.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And I think I need to just start by responding to your thing about the percentage of who wrote what, because a lot of the article actually is copy and pasting from the depth and breadth of literature that we have here in Aotearoa and across the world about youth work. So this is not necessarily new territory. It's a question that in some ways we've avoided for decades. You know, as youth work has developed as a profession and as a community, it's a question that we've avoided. And there are lots of people who have tackled it. And I just heard you say, Jane, that, you know, maybe we'll never get 100% consensus, and perhaps this is naive, but I would like to think that actually that is what we could do here in Aotearoa, that we could agree together, because, and to do that, we need to choose to be collaborative rather than resist this and kind of argue amongst ourselves, because we've probably all had experiences where a social worker said to us, I know this has definitely happened to me, youth work is a subset of social work, right? Or a youth worker has said something like, you're just specialized social work working with young people. It's a field of practice and what we already do. And most of us feel a bit hoha when we hear that. And in this journey of writing the article and collating the definitions, I did have to ask myself, do we resist that out of some form of sort of like arrogance or petulance that, you know, nah, I don't want to be a social worker, I want to be a youth worker? Or are we actually part of social work? So how would we know? How do we actually know? What's the language that we have that distinguishes youth work from other fields that also work with young people? The tricky thing, though, is that we don't want to define ourselves by what we're not. And we do need to discover what we are and who we are and how we are with young people and the kind of communities we serve.
Yeah, kia ora, Rod. Thanks for that. And well, let's break it down a little bit and touch on some of the main themes. Over to you, Rod. Some themes you think it's important to share right now to our viewers. Awesome.
Well, I think probably since Lloyd Martin in 2002 launched The Invisible Table, and the YDSA talked about quality relationships, and many of the other kind of discourses we had in Aotearoa highlighted the importance of the unique relationship in youth work. So the first common theme that strikes me is that, youth work has a particular type of relationship with young people. And here in Aotearoa, that relationship is also aware of the worlds in which young people live, right? So there are other relationships. So that youth work is relational and it's intergenerational, which can include being cultural and contextual. A word that's maybe a little bit less common, but maybe helpful, is associational, because the roots of youth work in terms of Indigenous practices here in Aotearoa, and also at the same time in other countries around the world, youth work was designed as a kind of a social method to increase relationships amongst young people themselves and with other people in their world, right? So that young people weren't detached, that they were connected. So I like to think that youth work is associational, that it's not just the relationship between us as a youth worker and a young person, but it's also the youth worker's responsibility to form relationships between young people and to strengthen relationships between young people and their parents, their siblings, their whānau, hapuiwi, that kind of stuff. So those are definite strong themes that came out: relational, intergenerational, and associational. There's also a theme which is about choice and whether or not young people choose to be involved in the youth work relationship or the youth service as a defining, distinguishing feature. And this is something that we absolutely have to start discussing. What kind of choice is it? So in the UK literature, they talk about voluntary participation or voluntary engagement, that youth work is only youth work when the young person has chosen to engage. So it brings some challenges, particularly in a youth justice setting. Can somebody working in a youth justice residence actually be a youth worker if the young people don't have a choice to be there or don't have a choice to work with that youth worker? Or is it possible if there are a bunch of youth workers working in a mandatory setting and young people choose which youth worker they have and how they engage? So there's some good stuff around choice, which I think is related to whaiwahitanga and the kind of common emphasis we've had around youth participation and leadership. And then the final things I would say in terms of themes that struck me were that youth work prioritizes fun, and that it's not a kind of trivial, nice thing to have, but it's actually core to our practice, because we recognize that young people don't often describe the rest of their lives with fun. If you ask a young person, how was school today? How often do they say, man, it was the most fun ever? They might occasionally, but it's not an everyday comment. And if you ask a young person, what's life like at home? How often are they going to say that it's fun? So if youth work can create, positive experiences for young people to socialize with their friends and have fun, that's a legitimate thing that's actually meeting a core human need.
Yeah, and I'm loving that, because hugely here at the office is activity-based engagements, and Peter's the master of it, and so he, the way he facilitates, you can just see the values coming through, like the aroha, and of course our young people see through all of that. If you're there just for the 9 to 5, well, you're not going to get much from our mokopuna. So it's great that you touched on that. Just back to you, Jane, any sort of strong themes that we haven't touched on before we move on?
Yeah, thank you. By the way, I do feel like I'm being interviewed by a radio host. You're very good at this, Noel. I'll just highlight, I think we've mentioned in passing that there's been an analysis of 21 different definitions that have been proposed. And they're categorised into Mātauranga Māori, New Zealand publications, and Lloyd Martin's The Invisible Table, as well as real work, have been really important with that. Some contemporary United Kingdom documents, relevant textbooks, and some global perspectives, as well as an article that helped bring them together, which was prepared by an incredible wahine called Trudy Cooper. So the analysis has been of a whole bunch of different contexts. And for those that are looking at the document itself, on page 26, you'll see that there's 5 themes that have been identified. And Rod's mentioned the top 4. So when you look internationally at all those different definitions, those themes have come through consistently and incredibly highly. So that being the relational nature, the voluntary aspect that needs to be considered. And I think we have put a lot of good work into that through our code of ethics, recognising different contexts of youth work that are not always able to be purely voluntary, social context, whānau, hapa iwi, etc., participation and fun. Yeah, so those were internationally across the board. What I think is quite interesting is when we looked at the Mātauranga Māori, as well as the Aotearoa specific ones, there were some themes that came through that we weren't seeing internationally. And so it highlights we are connected to a global community of youth work, and actually it contextually needs to make sense here in Aotearoa. Some of those themes were around things like intergenerationality, I think that's the word, like across the generations. And it's really interesting that a number of the articles in Kaiparahuarahi picked up on that theme. Themes like mana enhancing, the concept of mana, which of course is a kupu that is specific to Aotearoa, but many Indigenous cultures have aspects of these things, the strengths-based nature, the mana enhancing kind of nature of our practice. So those things are really interesting to us, and we think they need to be part of the definition. Not only is it what's across everybody, but also what needs to be thought about specifically here in the context of Aotearoa. So page 26 brings together the synthesis, the kind of the summary of those things, but the whole article explores the individual pieces.
Ka pai. And I just want to go to our chat line here. We've got a question in. What is the contribution of the rangatahi that we work with as youth workers when it comes to creating this definition? And what do they think of us? And what would they say to what we are writing and doing? So who wants to answer that one?
I can maybe start. I think that it's an excellent question. So youth voices have not been necessarily directly heard in this issue of Kaiparahuarahi because it's been written by youth workers for youth workers. And I think that I have asked young people this question myself in the past, and actually some of the other contributors have done research like this as well, right? Like what's important from a youth worker and what makes a good youth worker, and, compared to other people you might have in your life, like a teacher or a counselor or something. And I think some of the stuff, probably the themes I gave would be true for young people in reverse. So they'd probably start by talking about fun and food and friends and some of that stuff. But the kind of the approaches we have to practice, so whether or not it's important for a young person to choose to engage, I doubt young people are going to talk to us about the importance of voluntary engagement or relationality. They might talk about the relationship, but some of that stuff is because when it comes to a field of practice, young people might not know what they don't know, or they might not yet have discovered the language. So it is a good question that we need to spend some time with, asking young people today who are directly engaged with youth workers, what makes a good youth worker? And it's a question we need to ask of people who are now in their 30s and 40s, getting them to reflect on the youth workers they had in their life and what made them so unique. The last thing I'll say is that the work of Whaia Josie Keelan that's referred to here in the Mātauranga section, the first 4 definitions that we talk about, He Tipu e Rea was written with young people through a series of marae-based wānanga in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I think that her book, Ngā Reinga, Youth Development Māori Styles, is an essential for everybody working with young people. It's a free book that you can download online, and it's referenced in the journal article. And it's one of the few models for youth work and youth development, hands down worldwide, that was co-written with young people.
Yeah, kia ora, Rod. Hey, we'll take a break with a bit of a question here, quick fire question. How would you refer to our youth today, or how do you refer to our youth today? We know there's many a kupu out there. Organisations tend to choose one of those kupu, whether it's Māori or English. So kicking off with you, Jane, what's the kupu you use to refer to our young people, and why?
Okay, so I'm just going to take you through 2 or 3 of them, but I'll do it very quickly. I definitely prefer young people to youth if I'm using Pākehā kupu. I don't know why. Youth always doesn't feel right to me. Young people does. In the reo space, Ara Taiohi, obviously Ara pathways to or from, Taiohi young people. So Taiohi is in our name, and it is the word that I think we would use by intentionally use. Having said that, we talk about rangatahi a lot, and it is much more commonly understood kupu from a te reo point of view. And then when I go to different parts of the country, if I'm up in Te Tai Tokerau, I'm thinking Tai Tamariki, so I'm very aware of different spaces. Yeah, sorry, I covered most of them. A little bit of contextualization, but the young people, Taiohi and rangatahi would be my 3.
Yeah, and there's plenty of kupu out there. Kaitahu have their own kupu. Up in Taranaki, they use tātarakihi to describe young people, children. So what about you, Rod?
I'm very much the same. I think that I think we have to remember that linguistically, all languages are constantly evolving in a particular time and place, and we have a responsibility when working with particular communities, rohi, hapu, that we, as Jane says, tune into the kupu which are most appropriate there. But I would say if I was weighing up between Taiohi and rangatahi, I appreciate the kind of whakaro behind both kupu, and I'm really influenced by Whaia Josie's whakaro in I Te Puerea about the kind of the whakapapa of the kupu Taiohi.
Kia ora, thanks for that. Well, let's get back into our kaupapa, although that's still part of the kaupapa. We briefly touched on relationships. They're huge in our mahi, especially in the context of a youth development approach. It can be a lot of things to get your head around with so many models and frameworks out there. So to someone starting out, how would you summarize a youth development approach? We'll start with you, Jane.
I'd say read Kaiparahuarahi in the sense of, I think that's exactly what we're starting to do, is to define it. I think when I talk about the core of a youth development approach, the key things I want to pick up on is that it is relational, that it is strengths-based or mana enhancing, and the idea in mana taiohi around whaiwahitanga. So the idea that young people are actively chasing their place, actively participating in that. So literally the themes I think that we've identified in the article are the things I would highlight that are core to the youth development approach.
Kia ora, Rod, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's time. There's actually another theme that I forgot to acknowledge, which is about education. In the UK, they talk about youth work being informal education, or that youth workers are informal educators. So who's a formal educator? It's a teacher that young people are at between 9 to 3, and then young people are not in school, they're in other places, clubs, youth centres, churches, marae, whatever, with informal educators. So I think, to me, I'd really like us, when we think about our youth development approach, to think a bit more about the word development and what it actually means, because youth work and youth development is less about helping young people or fixing young people or solving problems, which has the kind of deficit lens that often social work has to respond to. And it's got more of an educative focus, which is about learning and growing and developing. And I'd love us to have a kind of national systemic conversation that shifted youth work away from social work towards more of kind of education and learning and development space.
Yeah, nice. And that's in the article, of course, being educative, protective, preventative, which no doubt, Oranga Tamariki sort of trying to focus more on that kaupapa. So leads me to the next question. Should practice be rooted in a voluntary relationship free from compulsion, or can youth work be imposed? We'll start with you, Rod.
I feel very strongly that youth work must not be imposed on young people, that young people need to have choices, because if we're going to do that whai wahitanga, that participatory stuff properly, then we need to start with the choice for young people to engage and to start in the first place.
Any thoughts, Jane?
Yeah, I agree with that very strong belief. And I have an equally strong belief that our rangatahi in spaces that have minimal choice or no choice really need good youth workers and need good youth development. And so our code of ethics, we spent a long time looking at the clauses that relate particularly to informed consent and what does it look like when you are in a mandatory setting and youth work is happening. And the way I think about it is, whether or not the young person has the choice to initially engage, there's a point in time, and you know it, like you know it here, like you know yourself when they've shifted from having to being with you to choosing to be with you. It's subtle but so tangible, and it just shifts everything. Personally, I think everything up until that moment where they're choosing to engage with you is pre-youth work. Okay, it's using all your youth work skills, but it's pre-youth work, and your youth work relationship starts from that choice to engage. And I do believe that in our mandatory contexts, our rangatahi, our taiohi are desperately needing from the choice to engage onwards. Yep, and there are some people in some mandatory contexts doing some incredible work in that space. I also think we need to unpack it more, but yeah, I think we have to find a place where we can acknowledge both.
And I'd like to add to that if we think about mandatory settings, actually youth work as a movement has a transformative potential to change the system, actually, rather than us going, oh, youth work is only in these settings over here where young people choose to be there, therefore you can't have youth work in those ones that they don't choose. Well, what if young people had more choice right from the outset in the youth justice system or in the care and protection process, right? And what if youth work became stronger in those settings that would actually transform the system?
Ka pai, mihi ana kia kōrua. I've got a question from the chat line. How do you see youth work evolving in the next 10 years? Do you see any changes we need to make or anything to stay grounded in? We'll start with you, Jane.
Oh gosh, what an excellent question. How do I see youth work evolving in the next 10 years? I love that you asked two pieces to that question. What do we need to stay grounded in? As well as how do we need to move? And I think part of this defining youth work article is about what do we need to stay grounded in. So that's my first thinking, is what do we need to stay grounded in? Relational, ethical, strengths-based, all the stuff we've been talking about. I think we need to stay grounded in those things. Where do we need to grow and develop? We are losing too many youth workers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, because the pay is shit for a lot of them. Okay, we need to have, I think youth work as a profession often has some good other supporting conditions. We often have quite flexible working conditions. We often get a lot of training, etc., etc. We want to strengthen those things, but to pay mortgage or rent in New Zealand, it's very hard to do on your average youth work salary. And so I think we need to strengthen professionally so that we can make strong arguments to the people who are funding, because I don't think our organisations are choosing to underpay youth workers. I think there's a lack, there's a systems lack in that space. So we must step into that. Otherwise, it is, if you can't feed your family, then it's really hard to keep doing the heart mahi full time. And so I think we will lose really good youth workers who will probably still do some voluntary stuff to other professions that have more in that space. I do think the work of Korowai Tupu is essential in this space, and the advocacy work that Korowai Tupu and Ara Taiohi do. I mean, we're the same organisation, but different functions. The work that we're doing to advocate in that space is really important, and having a groundswell of youth workers behind us is really important as well. We don't want to go so far down the track of playing we want to make sure we stay core to the kaupapa of who we are, which is all the stuff I talked about as well, and grounded in Te Ao Māori, which I didn't mention before. Those things must stay strong, but we also need to pay people what they're worth. Rod?
Anything
I
to
think it's like that whakatauki about looking back to move forward. And during this process, right, of putting the article together, when we looked back at some of the things that have been published, one of the first recorded things that I found about youth workers from 1980, this book called Youth in Perspective, which was written by something called the National Youth Council. It wasn't a youth council like we think of a youth council today. It was all the kind of heads of the large organizations at the time. And there's a chapter in there about youth workers, which when we read now in 2021, we look back on 1980 and kind of laugh a bit, you know, like, oh, some of those ideas are so silly. And that helps us realize how far we've come, even when we look back at things from 2010 or 2000, right? And the Code of Ethics is an example of something that's regularly refreshed and reviewed, because youth work practice is dynamic and it responds to the evolving needs of young people. Like when I started in youth work, we didn't have social media and nobody had cell phones, you know, and we were talking about whether or not it was ethical to give young people your landline phone number. So we know that society will change, the big picture, te ao will change, and youth work will be responsive to that. And I think to put us in the best position to continue to exist, to be responsive, we need to strengthen our youth worker community in Aotearoa. And I think that we are probably on borrowed time, and we should start to, you know, freak out a little bit, because there have been some threats to our practice, like Jane talked about earlier. The Social Work Registration Board were including in their scope of practice youth work, you know, formally, which would have been part of legislation. And they did that without consulting with youth workers. And, you know, I can understand why they did that. Like, this is no beef against them. They would only know to consult with youth workers if the public consciousness and other professions are aware that youth workers have a strong professional association. There are 2,500 people that on the last census, when they had to write occupation, wrote youth worker. And I would love it if those 2,500 people felt strong enough to write youth worker on their census form, and then could also fill out the koroai tupu form or engage in that process. I really do believe that it's crucial that we unite, and we make the association good by being members within, rather than being critical about the association, saying, oh, I'm not going to join yet until A, B, C, D, or whatever. The only way for our association to be strong is for us all to come under the koroai. That's why it's called a koroai of growth.
Kia ora. We've got another question here from the chat line, and just want to acknowledge our tuakana from the Pacific. And of course, in some Pacific settings, youth work is often started by parents, pastors, leaders, in the whānau, in the church. So when are you too old to be a youth worker, and how can you encourage them to simply get out of the way? We'll go to you, Jane.
You're the oldest, Jane. Wisest.
Thanks for that, Rod. This is not an actual model, but there's a guy who wrote a book, a guy called Tim Hawkins, who wrote a book that talks about the different ages of youth workers, and he parallels the same-aged youth work, peer youth workers, slightly older youth workers, like older sibling, cool auntie, parent, grandparent, and he looks at the strengths and weaknesses that there are being a youth worker at all those different phases. You know, the young ones have got slightly more energy and often easier to relate to for some things, but actually young people themselves often find talking about some of those really hard things easier to do with somebody who's older. So for me, it's not about how can we get them out of the way. For me, it's about how can we help people to understand the different strengths that you hold at different spaces. And I wish I could quote this, but I know Matua Lloyd hates it when I call him Matua Lloyd, but Matua Lloyd shared, I think, 2 weeks ago on Kōrero Café, and kind of talked about in the age and stage that he's in, kind of what his role is within the sector with young people, but also, yeah, I think it's more about getting out of the way and not trying to prevent, because youth work is strong when it crosses those generations, not when we eliminate any of those generations.
Yeah, somebody I know asked a young person once, how old is too old to be a youth worker? And the young person stopped and thought for a moment and said, I'll take seriously the oldest person that takes me seriously.
Nice. Yeah, awesome. Hey, just some quick fire questions. A great youth worker always carries a what? We'll go to you, Jane.
The very new, fresh off the press, code of ethics cards that you can use in your ethical practice. I'm only half joking. It is a new resource, but the people that we've shown it to are really finding it hugely rich, really beautiful. So please check it out. It is a tool that is super practical, and I think can help you in that space. Rod?
I'd say a pencil case full of coloured pens.
Nice, bit of an artist and a nice actor too. Another quick fire question: what is the most valuable lesson a young person has ever taught you? We'll go with you, Rod.
Well, I need some time to think about that. I look, the first thing that comes to mind for me is about the long-term potential of youth work. And actually, it's another defining feature of our practice, that we're not bound by the school year, a series of terms, or 6 50-minute, hour-long counselling sessions. That youth work can be long-term and open-ended. And I think that the greatest enduring transformation and change that I've seen in young people, the ones that I've been privileged to journey with beyond when they may have been legally considered youth.
I think, and I've got this both from my biological children as well as from rangatahi I've worked through the years, like to just be myself. The try hard youth work, it's, you know, I am who I am. I have my own culture. I have my own upbringing. And if I try not to, you know, to think I'm going to be cooler to step into their spaces, they quickly knock you back, like so quickly. And so to be genuinely interested in relationship, but to do that in the confidence of who I am and my identity, with my whakapapa in my space, and then create relationship based on those two things, that would be one of the biggest lessons.
Yeah, can't point. Well, I think we're over time, but when we've got two rangatira like you two in the room, I think we can go all day. But this partai is around Te Ao Māori, but probably on a world level, Indigenous models of practice. You know, a lot of organisations, I hear a lot of, we're on this Te Tiriti journey. We're bringing mātou ranga Māori into our work, into our space. We're hiring principal Māori advisors to help guide our office. So I suppose, you know, what does that look like in youth development, or more importantly, how are Indigenous models and Indigenous ways of life affecting the youth development space? I mean, how can that work to benefit us all? We'll go with you, Rod.
I think it's a bit of that look back to look forward again, really, that one of the tasks we all need to do, especially here in Aotearoa, but my challenge would be to all people working in all places across the world, is to discover, learn and rediscover the traditional Indigenous pre-colonial approaches to supporting, developing and growing Taiohi, young people as leaders. And what most Indigenous cultures, and certainly what that I've, you know, I suppose there's always going to be limited because there's, you know, millions of these across the world, but the few that I've learned about, and particularly those who are, you know, native to Aotearoa, are really aware of the well-being of the whole people, right? And that locating the youth work, what we now call the youth work relationship, as part of something that sustains the well-being of all. And we can learn a lot from that. And then I think we have to do so if we learn about the traditional Indigenous pre-colonial approaches, then there's a conversation, I think, to be had in partnership, which is what parts of this can we translate into 2021, and how do we make sure that we're not doing that in a recolonizing way, but we're doing that in a way that's led by, and can we take the lead from and learn from Indigenous whānau today.
Jane, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll keep it concise. And I know we were talking pre this hui about how we could spend a whole seminar on this topic. For me, the fundamental there's lots of differences. One of the most significant differences between Indigenous approaches and say Western approaches is that across all Indigenous cultures, the value of the collectivism rather than the individualism. So seeing that human as part of their whānau hapu iwi and not being able to separate that out versus the individualistic approach. I mean, individualistic approaches benefits one culture, and I use that both ethnically and generally, will benefit one culture, and you'll have the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and it does not benefit the whole. And so I think there are fundamental flaws in any kind of individualistic approach. And so we must be informed by Indigenous wisdom, knowledge, mātauranga, because it is about the whole. And it's not about one at the expense of the other. And it's about how we hold power and how we engage. So for us here in Aotearoa, obviously with Te Tiriti, but also the Indigenous people of this nation are tangata whenua. So they are essential for our youth work in Aotearoa to move forward, as are all the cultures, including Pākehā culture, but the ethnic communities that exist in New Zealand. These are very important ingredients for us to do something that will see our vision be achieved. Te pua waitanga Taiohi Aotearoa. Yeah, we need our young people to thrive, and they are not with an individualistic approach.
Kia ora. Yeah, and I just want to add to that, and reflecting on my time as a youth worker in residence, was the severe conduct disorder program back in the days here in Epuni, Lower Huts, where they tried to weave Western models with Māori models. But obviously it's quite tough to do that. You know, it was unprofessional for us to hongi, you know, it was unprofessional for us to do miri. So there was a lot of clashes, as we all know, with those cultures, but no doubt, hopefully, you know, we're still on that journey, and one day we'll be able to get there and realize the full potential of that treaty partnership. So I just want to acknowledge you for that kōrero. Hoi anō, e te ui, I think we're counting down to the end of our whakapāhotanga i tēnei rangi, and just want to finish on a kōrero, a pātai to our panelists today. Rod, we'll start with you. Someone, a person, it might have been a moment, a thing that inspired you to get into this mahi.
I think I'll go back to my mate from the comic shop, who, even though every Wednesday after school, I ostensibly went there to buy the latest issue of the X-Men, and then sort of hung around too long until the shop was closed. He listened to me. Nice.
Jane, what about you?
I often answer this question around the young people themselves. So my children and my young people, you know, the young people I've worked with. But today I want to honour somebody who didn't start me on the journey, but actually his influence for the nation is something that has been inspiring for me and has kept me on the path. So your boss, for a little longer, Judge Andrew Breakoft, is one of the humans that actually has been very inspiring for me in this, and he's an avid supporter of rangatahi, of youth work, being a lawyer initially, principal judge of the youth court, and holds a lot of wisdom in mātauranga that's inspired me.
Kia ora. Well, before we whakakapi, just want to open some space. Rod, we'll start with you for some final comments.
Thanks, Noel. I think in the article on page 18, in the bottom left corner, are a couple of challenging questions for us, which come from the work of some wise people, but I might just read this to close. Few people actually know what youth workers do, and youth workers are bad at explaining this. I know that's been true with my own family. When asked to describe their job, youth workers often rely on words and phrases that mean little to the general public. Although the delivery of youth work is very highly skilled, youth workers are not always aware of the skills they are using. We might say something like, well, I just do it. I don't really know why it works. It just does. And our challenge now is to overcome those struggles and to stand strong in language that our families and the general public celebrate about the important contribution that youth work makes to the well-being of young people and the well-being of all in Aotearoa.
Kia ora, Rod. And Jane, for your kōrero whakamutunga?
I think I finished acknowledging a wero and offering a wero. Acknowledging the wero from the question that came through in the chat around the role of young people as we move forward in defining youth work. And related to that, I think there is a whittle for our team at Ara Taiohi to think about how do we gather those voices? How do we collect, how do we make sure they're all going into the kite so that we can move forward? The offering of a whittle is that we need the voices of those who are contributing to the chat and listening today and watching at a future time. Please think about how you define youth work, read the article, the articles, wrong one, read them, read all the Kaiparahuarahi, but in this sense, have a good read of the 4th edition and start to share your thoughts and your whakaaro and the wisdom that you hold, because that wisdom represents the many relationships you have held with rangatahi over a lengthy period of time. Though that mātauranga also represents the heroes of our sector who have inputted into you and where you're at today. And it's that type of wisdom that we want to have to I guess I'm using some cheesy words, but to unite us around the definition in youth work. So thank you for engaging and participating and being here. But also please think about, reflect, and get back to us, any of us at the Ara Taiohi team, any of the contributors to Kaiparahuarahi, because we'd love to see this progress.
Yeah, kia ora. Hoi anō, mihi tue ao kai kōrero mō te rangi nei nā rangatira Rod Baxter au called Jane Zintl. Just want to send a mihi to Ara Taiohi, korowai tupu, and all the great mahi you do with regards to our youth work community and collaboration. To all our youth workers out there, kia kaha, those that are current and are studying, mihi ana kia koutou kia kaha, kai roto I ngā mahi katoa ki te whakarangatira I ngā mokopuna. To all our manuhiri watching the stream or have joined us on the replay, tēnā koutou katoa, some great questions today. And just want to take time to acknowledge all our kai kōrero over this month for the rich insights into te ao ngā mokopuna on this series of Kai Kōrero. And you can catch all those kōrero sessions on the website at arataiohi.org.nz. Hoi anō, there's a bit of a saying out there ko ngā rangatahi, ngā rangatira mō a pōpō. Our young people are the leaders of tomorrow. And maybe it's time to change that narrative because they are leaders of today as well. Ko rātou ngā rangatira o te naia nei, nā reira. Mihi ana ki ngā taiohi mokopuna rangatahi tātaraki puta noa I te motu. Hoi anō, ai whakamutu I tēnei o ngā papahotanga anei rātou tātou nei karakia. Unuhia ki te uru tapu nui kia wātea kia māma te nākau te tinana te wairua ki te aratakata. Koiara e rongo whakairihia ake kirunga hei turuturu o whitika whakamaua kia tina haumie huie. Tae ki e. Tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Kia ora, Shannon here. Nā mihi nui. Thanks so much for joining us in the latest season of Kōrero Café. Thanks to all the hosts and authors. You can catch up on episodes by heading back to our Kōrero Café playlist. You can purchase any edition of Kaiparahuarahi, the Journal for Youth Work in Aotearoa, at our website, www.arataiohi.org.nz. Cheers!